When I first moved into the neighborhood, I didn't think much of it. The rules seemed strict, sure, but manageable. No tall fences, no unapproved flowers, and every house required a shade of beige paint within the HOA-approved spectrum. I shrugged it off at the time, figuring beige was harmless. But over the years, the monotony wore on me. Each morning, I'd step out to fetch the paper and see the same dull palette. Sand beige, light taupe, pale tan, oatmeal beige, khaki beige. It was as if creativity had been surgically removed from the entire community. Everyone's home looked the same, their yards indistinguishable, their curb appeal muted by the HOA's obsession with harmony. The trouble began when the HOA board decided it was time for repainting. They mailed out notices instructing every homeowner to refresh their exteriors, claiming it was to maintain property values. Along with the notice came a color swatch booklet. It contained 12 nearly identical shades of beige. The difference between them was so minuscule that one would have to squint to see it. But the HOA took the matter deadly seriously. I wasn't thrilled about the expense, but I wasn't looking for a fight either. That changed when I received a personal letter from the HOA president herself, Mrs. Karen Whitfield. She was a sharp-featured woman with a tight blonde bob haircut, always striding around with a clipboard like she was the general of some suburban army. Her letter was condescending, dripping with authority. She reminded me that my house, after inspection, was found to be fading out of compliance and required repainting immediately. She even circled her preferred beige shade, Desert Sand No. 7, as if she were choosing for me. Something in me snapped at that point. Maybe it was the years of silent conformity, or maybe it was the smugness in her words. Whatever it was, I wasn't about to let Karen dictate what color went on my house. I dug into the HOA bylaws, combing through the dense legal language. It was tedious, but after hours of reading, I found what I needed. The HOA's rules didn't just say beige. They specified any shade of beige within the natural color spectrum, not exceeding the brightness and saturation thresholds defined in Appendix B. Appendix B. That was the key. Buried at the back of the rules was a chart with color codes and numbers, values for hue, brightness, and saturation. The HOA had essentially turned beige into a scientific formula, thinking it would keep everyone uniform. What they didn't expect was that someone would use that loophole against them. I realized that while the HOA restricted us to beige, it didn't limit us to subtle beige. By pushing the brightness and saturation right up to the maximum values allowed, I could technically create the boldest, loudest beige imaginable. It would still be beige, but it would glow, shimmer, and scream from the curb. The idea thrilled me. For once, I could hit back at the HOA using their own rulebook. They wanted beige? I'd give them beige, more beige than they could handle. The next week, I hired a painting crew. When I showed them the custom mixed paint I'd ordered, their eyes widened. Under the sunlight, it looked almost surreal, a blinding beige so bright it seemed to radiate heat. It wasn't neon, it wasn't gold, it wasn't yellow. It was beige, but turned up to 11. As the painters rolled the first strokes onto my house, I felt a rush of rebellious satisfaction. This wasn't just repainting. This was a declaration of war, a message to the HOA that I wouldn't be steamrolled by their endless need for control. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to notice. By day 2, my house looked like it had been dipped in molten sand. Drivers slowed down as they passed. Neighbors whispered in their driveways. Some laughed, others shook their heads. But the loudest reaction came from Karen. She stormed onto my lawn the moment she saw it, clipboard in hand, fuming. From behind my window, I watched her pace, scribble notes, and wave her arms like she was commanding an invisible army. She knocked furiously at my door, but I let her stew. I knew what she'd do next. File a complaint, draft a fine, maybe even threaten legal action. But what she didn't know was that I had already prepared. I had the paint receipts, the color codes, and the HOA's very own Appendix B printed and highlighted. I was ready for the fight. When the painting was finally complete, the effect was undeniable. My house didn't just blend in. It blazed like a beacon among the muted rows of taupe and sand. Under the midday sun, it reflected light like a desert mirage. It was still beige, technically compliant, but it dominated the street. That night, as I stood in my driveway admiring the result, I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on me. Curtains twitched, porch lights flickered on, and the whispers carried across lawns. Some saw me as reckless, others as a hero. But one thing was certain: the HOA had a new problem on their hands. And this was only the beginning. Because I hadn't just painted my house, I'd started a rebellion, and the first shot had been fired. The next chapter wouldn't be about paint alone. It would be about power, control, and how far an HOA would go to crush defiance. The morning after my house stood freshly coated in the loudest, boldest beige ever concocted, the entire neighborhood seemed to buzz with unease. Curtains opened earlier than usual. Joggers slowed their pace as they passed by, stealing extra glances. Dog walkers pulled their pets along, half distracted, half stunned. My house didn't just stand out. It announced itself like a spotlight in a sea of shadows. And as I expected, the HOA wasted no time mobilizing. By noon, an emergency compliance meeting, notice had been posted to every mailbox in the subdivision. The letter was printed in bold, uppercase font, with Karen's signature stamped dramatically at the bottom. It read as if the fate of the neighborhood depended on restoring order against a single rebellious homeowner, me. I could almost hear the panic in their wording. Unapproved color deviations threaten the visual harmony of our community. Property values may suffer if action is not immediately taken. And my favorite line of all: the non-conforming beige is a violation of the spirit of community uniformity. The spirit of uniformity. What a phrase. Nowhere in the bylaws did such language exist, and I knew it. They were stretching their power, clinging to vague interpretations. But here's where things got interesting. As neighbors walked their streets that afternoon, many of them stopped by. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering about how I had gone too far. But others, more than I, expected, smiled knowingly, whispered words of encouragement, or gave subtle nods of support. It dawned on me that I wasn't the only one fed up with the HOA's suffocating rules. My house had become a symbol. To some, it was an eyesore, but to others, it was a banner of resistance. The emergency meeting was held that Friday evening at the HOA clubhouse. I didn't attend. Instead, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, and watched the parade of SUVs and minivans stream down the road. The entire board was present, along with nearly half the neighborhood. Lights blazed inside the glass-walled clubhouse, and shadows gestured wildly as voices rose. From across the street, I saw Karen at the head of the table, waving her arms in frustration. She pointed toward my house multiple times. Her body language screamed indignation. And yet, I could also see the subtle but undeniable truth. Not everyone was on her side. Some neighbors leaned back with folded arms. Others gestured toward my direction in what looked like agreement. The HOA's grip was weakening. By the next morning, flyers appeared taped to lampposts and tucked into doors. "Stop the beige nuisance," they read in blocky font. They demanded I repaint my house to a reasonable shade of beige. It was signed, predictably, by Karen herself. But something else had started too. Quietly, other neighbors began testing the limits of the bylaws. One house down the block repainted their shutters a noticeably richer. Beige, technically compliant, but a daring move compared to their previous dull shade. Another neighbor swapped out their lawn, furniture for bright beige, cushions that reflected like polished stone. Small acts, subtle acts, but acts of rebellion nonetheless. It was as if my house had cracked open a door, and others were peeking through to see what freedom looked like. Of course, Karen wasn't about to let the momentum grow. A week later, I received my first official violation notice. It was printed on HOA letterhead and worded with cold authority. "You are hereby fined $500 for non-compliance with HOA exterior color guidelines." The letter cited the same Appendix B I had studied, claiming I had exceeded the permissible brightness thresholds. But their evidence? A photograph of my house under direct noon sunlight, an intentionally misleading shot. I laughed when I read it. I had already taken my own photographs at different times of day, along with receipts from the paint manufacturer, listing the exact RGB values and brightness. All of it fell squarely within the HOA's published limits. They had no case. Instead of paying, I mailed a letter of my own. I attached my documentation, highlighted the precise sections of Appendix B, and ended with a single line. "Your fine is unenforceable." The silence from their end was delicious. But that silence didn't last long. A few days later, I came home to find a group of board members standing on my lawn with clipboards and measuring tools. They squabbled among themselves, taking photos, jotting notes, and shaking their heads dramatically. Karen stood in the center of it all, hands on hips, glaring at my house as if sheer force of will could bleach it duller. I didn't confront them. Instead, I documented them. I filmed their every move from my window, time-stamped the footage, and saved it. If they wanted to escalate, I would be ready. And escalate they did. Within 2 weeks, a second violation notice appeared. This time, the fine doubled to $1,000. They accused me of intentional disruption of community, standards, and provoking disharmony. The language grew more desperate, less legal. They weren't just trying to enforce a rule, they were trying to make an example of me. But their plan backfired. The more they targeted me, the more neighbors began to rebel in small ways. One homeowner planted flowers in unapproved colors. Another extended their patio furniture into the front yard. A third replaced their standard beige curtains with a brighter, glossier variant. Each time, Karen sent out violation letters, but the wave was growing too fast for her to control. Soon, whispers spread of a petition circulating quietly through the neighborhood. Some residents wanted a vote to limit the board's power, to curb Karen's authoritarian grip. Others wanted her removed altogether. I didn't start the petition, but I didn't need to. My house had already lit the spark. By the time summer rolled in, the street looked subtly different. The HOA still held meetings, still mailed threats, but cracks had formed in their once iron rule. And through it all, my house stood bright and unyielding, the loudest beige on the block. Of course, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to give up. No, she was biding her time, waiting for a bigger move, and I could sense it. The storm wasn't over. The real battle hadn't even begun. Because Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting the neighborhood. And in the coming weeks, she was about to show just how far she'd go to crush defiance. By midsummer, the street no longer looked like the HOA's picture-perfect brochure. Where once uniformity reigned, now tiny fractures spread across the neighborhood facade. A house here with slightly brighter shutters, another with bold beige trim, a front door just a shade warmer than the rest. It wasn't chaos, but it was change. And in an HOA's world, change was a threat. Karen Whitfield, ever the self-appointed general, could sense her authority slipping. For years, she had maintained a perfect grip over the neighborhood, policing everything from mailbox flags to holiday decorations. But now, thanks to my house blazing in full-throttle beige, that grip was weakening. Her strategy shifted. If fines and letters couldn't scare me into submission, she would escalate. It began with intimidation. One afternoon, I returned home to find a bright orange notice posted on my garage door. Final warning was stamped in bold across the top. The paper threatened legal action, liens on my property, even forced repainting at my expense. It read less like a professional document, and more like a personal vendetta typed out in a fit of rage. Of course, the HOA didn't have that kind of unilateral power. But intimidation works best when homeowners don't know their rights. And Karen had long relied on fear and ignorance to keep everyone in line. The problem for her was simple. I wasn't afraid and I wasn't ignorant. I saved every letter, photographed every notice, and documented each attempt at harassment. A binder on my desk was already thick with evidence. If she wanted to escalate, she'd be walking straight into her own trap. But Karen wasn't just targeting me anymore. Soon, neighbors who had dared to tweak their homes received violation notices too. A man 3 houses down was fined for planting beige roses that were too vivid. A family across the street was cited for patio cushions that clashed with the aesthetic. Even minor infractions were met with heavy-handed threats. Instead of quelling rebellion, her tactics inflamed it. Whispers turned into meetings. Meetings turned into organization. The quiet petition I'd heard rumors about was now circulating openly. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were signing their names. Some wanted to curb fines, others wanted transparency. But one demand echoed the loudest: remove Karen from the board. For the first time, the HOA was split. Karen responded by doubling down. She called an extraordinary Compliance Summit, a grandiose name for what was essentially a board meeting, stacked with her loyalists. Flyers announcing the summit appeared on every mailbox, filled with fear-mongering language about rogue homeowners, threatening community stability. On the night of the summit, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed. Residents crammed inside, voices tense, some eager to defend their freedom, others afraid of property values plummeting. From my porch, I could hear the muffled rise and fall of heated debate echoing across the street. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. My house was the uninvited guest looming over their every word. When the meeting adjourned hours later, the fallout became clear. The HOA announced the creation of a new color compliance task force, a small group with the power to inspect, report and recommend punitive measures against non-conforming properties. In other words, Karen had deputized a squad of neighbors to patrol the subdivision, like suburban watchdogs. The very next day, 2 men and a woman with clipboards walked slowly past my house, snapping photos and muttering among themselves. One even crouched to take a close-up of the siding, as if beige could somehow be criminal if magnified enough. It was laughable. But beneath the absurdity, it was dangerous. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building an army of loyal enforcers. And yet the pushback continued. Late one evening, I noticed something curious. Across the street, a neighbor's garage door had been painted. Not beige, not tan, but a blazing, reflective, high-saturation beige that nearly rivaled mine, a statement bold and unmissable. The next day, another home added bold beige trim around its windows. Then another swapped their dull, beige driveway borders with brighter pavers that practically gleamed. It was spreading. One by one, homeowners were pushing the boundaries, emboldened by my stand. Karen's worst nightmare was unfolding, a full-blown beige rebellion. In response, she shifted tactics once more. Her next letter accused me of inciting non-compliance. She framed me as the ringleader, blaming me for the spread of aesthetic disorder across the neighborhood. According to her, my home was the catalyst for disobedience, and unless I repainted, the board would pursue all available remedies. What she didn't realize was that her language, all available remedies, was exactly the overreach I had been waiting for. Because behind the scenes, I wasn't just stockpiling letters. I was consulting with an attorney, a specialist in HOA law, and the more I showed him, the wider his grin grew. He explained that the HOA had boxed themselves in. Their bylaws were binding, but only as far as they were written. Appendix B's thresholds were absolute, and I was well within them. Every attempt to fine me without proof of actual violation wasn't just unenforceable, it was harassment. And harassment, when documented, could flip the legal tables entirely. I wasn't just defending my right to paint my house. I was building a case that could cripple the HOA. Still, Karen didn't slow down. By late August, she sent contractors to measure my property lines, claiming I'd planted a shrub over the boundary. She ordered surprise inspections for safety compliance. She even called city code enforcement. Though each time, inspectors shrugged and confirmed I was fully compliant. But the more she fought, the more ridiculous she looked. And the more ridiculous she looked, the more neighbors joined the quiet resistance. It reached a boiling point when the HOA mailed out a proposed amendment to the bylaws. The amendment sought to remove Appendix B entirely, replacing it with a vague rule giving the board full discretion over paint colors. In short, Karen wanted unchecked power. But to pass, the amendment required a community-wide vote. For the first time, the HOA's control rested not on threats or fines, but on the will of the people. And by now, the people were divided. When ballots were mailed out, I could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors whispered in driveways, exchanged glances on sidewalks. Some feared retaliation if they voted against Karen, while others eagerly waited for the chance to finally strip her power. The deadline loomed, and the HOA braced for the result. Meanwhile, I kept my house blazing bright, the loudest beige in the subdivision. A symbol, a beacon, a reminder of the fight. And deep down, I knew one thing. Win or lose, the beige war had only just begun. Because Karen wasn't finished. If she couldn't beat me with rules, fines, or amendments, she would find another way. And the next battle wasn't going to be fought with paint. It was going to be fought in court. The ballots for the HOA amendment were counted on a humid September evening. The clubhouse lights burned late into the night, and shadows of board members loomed against the curtained windows as they tallied the votes. By morning, the result was slipped into every mailbox. The amendment had failed. Karen's attempt to seize discretionary power over paint colors had been stopped cold by the very residents she had long controlled. For years, she had ruled by fear, but the rebellion of Beige had awakened something new. The news spread quickly. Some celebrated quietly, a few openly. Others simply breathed easier, relieved that the bylaws would stay intact. But while the neighborhood exhaled, I knew better than to believe the war was over. Karen had lost the battle, but she wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully. When rules and votes failed her, there was only one option left in her arsenal: the courts. 2 weeks later, I received the notice. The envelope was thick, stamped with the mark of a law office. Inside was a formal complaint. The HOA versus me. Karen had convinced the board, at least her loyalists, to authorize legal action. They accused me of malicious compliance, of painting my home in a way that undermined the spirit of the covenants, despite technical adherence. Their claim was that I had acted in bad faith, weaponizing the rules against the community. It was laughable on its face, but it was also dangerous. Lawsuits were expensive, and HOAs often thrived on the fact that most homeowners couldn't stomach the cost of defense. They'd bury people in fees until surrender felt like the only option. But this time, they'd picked the wrong homeowner. My binder of documentation had already grown thick with every letter, every fine, every absurd notice they'd posted on my door. I had photographs with timestamps, video recordings of their so-called task force trespassing onto my property, and even copies of Karen's inflammatory flyers. Where she saw control, I saw evidence. I called my attorney the same day. He flipped through the stack of documents with a grin that widened the deeper he went. "They've given us everything we need," he said, tapping a notice Karen had plastered to my garage. "This isn't just unenforceable. This is harassment, and if we play this right, we can countersue." The idea wasn't just to defend myself, it was to strike back. The first hearing was set in late October at the county courthouse. The building stood tall and imposing, its stone steps worn by decades of legal battles. The morning air was sharp, filled with the scent of damp leaves. As I walked up those steps, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about paint anymore, it was about principle. Inside, the courtroom hummed with quiet tension. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, posture rigid, a stack of papers neatly organized before her. She wore her signature red blazer, the same one she used to patrol the neighborhood with her clipboard, as though trying to turn her suburban authority into legal weight. Her expression was sharp, but beneath it I saw flickers of unease. Her attorney, a polished man in a gray suit, laid out their argument that my paint, though technically beige, was intentionally disruptive, or a violation of the community spirit. He gestured toward enlarged photos of my house, taken at the brightest hours of the day, as though the sunlight itself were evidence of guilt. He spoke of property values, of visual disharmony, of the need to preserve uniformity for the good of all. Then it was our turn. My attorney rose calmly, methodically unpacking Appendix B of the HOA bylaws. He projected the very chart Karen's board had created, the thresholds of brightness and saturation that defined permissible beige. He compared their own numbers against the paint I had used, pointing out with precision that my house fell within every limit. "Compliance," he said firmly, "is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of definition. And by their own definition, my client is fully compliant." He didn't stop there. He held up the stack of violation notices, the escalating fines, the threatening language that strayed from legal enforcement into personal intimidation. He played video clips of the so-called task force trespassing on my property, measuring shrubs and snapping photos like amateur detectives. He highlighted the failed amendment, proof that the community itself had rejected Karen's attempt at power. And finally, he turned to the judge and said, "This is not about Beige. This is about an HOA president abusing her. Authority to target one. Homeowner in a campaign of harassment." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The judge, a woman with a reputation for sharp wit, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. "I see bylaws. I see thresholds. I see compliance. What I don't see is a violation." The HOA's attorney sputtered, trying to reframe the argument around intent, around the nebulous spirit of the rules. But the judge wasn't buying it. Rules, she reminded them, were not about spirit. They were about words, and the words in Appendix B were clear. By the end of the hearing, the lawsuit was dismissed. My house, the loudest Beige in the neighborhood, was declared fully compliant. But the victory didn't end there. The judge noted the volume of evidence I'd provided of harassment. She didn't issue a ruling on it that day, but she did something better. She opened the door for me to countersue. And as Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her red blazer flashing like a warning light, I knew the war had shifted. For years she had ruled unchecked, unchallenged, confident that fear alone would keep her neighbors in line. But now the courts had spoken, and her authority was crumbling. Back home, my neighbors greeted me differently. Some shook my hand openly, thanking me for standing up. Others nodded from their driveways, emboldened but cautious. Word spread quickly. The HOA had lost. Karen had failed. And the rebellion of Beige was no longer just symbolic. It was legal. But I also knew Karen wasn't done. Defeat only hardened her resolve. She would come back, perhaps subtler, perhaps more desperate. And as the leaves turned and the nights grew colder, the neighborhood braced itself for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain. Karen wasn't going down without a final fight. And the final fight was going to be uglier than anything the neighborhood had seen before. The ballots for the HOA amendment were counted on a humid September evening. The clubhouse lights burned late into the night, and shadows of board members loomed against the curtained windows as they tallied the votes. By morning, the result was slipped into every mailbox. The amendment had failed. Karen's attempt to seize discretionary power over paint colors had been stopped cold by the very residents she had long controlled. For years, she had ruled by fear. But the rebellion of Beige had awakened something no HOA rulebook could suppress: resentment. The news spread quickly. Some celebrated quietly, a few openly. Others simply breathed easier, relieved that the bylaws would stay intact. But while the neighborhood exhaled, I knew better than to believe the war was over. Karen had lost the battle, but she wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully. When rules and votes failed her, there was only one option left in her arsenal: the courts. 2 weeks later, I received the notice. The envelope was thick, stamped with the mark of a law office. Inside was a formal complaint. The HOA versus me. Karen had convinced the board, at least her loyalists, to authorize legal action. They accused me of malicious compliance, of painting my home in a way that undermined the spirit of the covenants, despite technical adherence. Their claim was that I had acted in bad faith, weaponizing the rules against the community. It was laughable on its face, but it was also dangerous. Lawsuits were expensive, and HOAs often thrived on the fact that most homeowners couldn't stomach the cost of defense. They'd bury people in fees until surrender felt like the only option. But this time, they'd picked the wrong homeowner. My binder of documentation had already grown thick with every letter. Every fine, every absurd notice they'd posted on my door. I had photographs with timestamps, video recordings of their so-called task force trespassing onto my property, and even copies of Karen's inflammatory flyers. Where she saw control, I saw evidence. I called my attorney the same day. He flipped through the stack of documents with a grin that widened the deeper he went. "They've given us everything we need," he said, tapping a notice Karen had plastered to my garage. "This isn't just unenforceable. This is harassment. And if we play this right, we can countersue." The idea wasn't just to defend myself, it was to strike back. The first hearing was set in late October at the county courthouse. The building stood tall and imposing, its stone steps worn by decades of legal battles. The morning air was sharp, filled with the scent of damp leaves. As I walked up those steps, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about paint anymore. It was about principle. Inside, the courtroom hummed with quiet tension. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, posture rigid, a stack of papers neatly organized before her. She wore her signature red blazer, the same one she used to patrol the neighborhood with her clipboard, as though trying to turn her suburban authority into legal weight. Her expression was sharp, but beneath it I saw flickers of unease. Her attorney, a polished man in a gray suit, laid out their argument that my paint, though technically beige, was intentionally disruptive, a violation of the community spirit. He gestured toward enlarged photos of my house, taken at the brightest hours of the day, as though the sunlight itself were evidence of guilt. He spoke of property values, of visual disharmony, of the need to preserve uniformity for the good of all. Then it was our turn. My attorney rose calmly, methodically unpacking Appendix B of the HOA bylaws. He projected the very chart Karen's board had created, the thresholds of brightness and saturation that defined permissible beige. He compared their own numbers against the paint I had used, pointing out with precision that my house fell within every limit. Compliance, he said firmly, is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of definition. And by their own definition, my client is fully compliant. He didn't stop there. He held up the stack of violation notices, the escalating fines, the threatening language that strayed from legal enforcement into personal intimidation. He played video clips of the so-called task force trespassing on my property, measuring shrubs and snapping photos like amateur detectives. He highlighted the failed amendment, proof that the community itself had rejected Karen's attempt at power. And finally, he turned to the judge and said, "This is not about beige. This is about an HOA president abusing her authority to target one homeowner in a campaign of harassment." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The judge, a woman with a reputation for sharp wit, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. "I see bylaws. I see thresholds. I see compliance. What I don't see is a violation." The HOA's attorney sputtered, trying to reframe the argument around intent, around the nebulous spirit of the rules. But the judge wasn't buying it. Rules, she reminded them, were not about spirit. They were about words, and the words in Appendix B were clear. By the end of the hearing, the lawsuit was dismissed. My house, the loudest beige in the neighborhood, was declared fully compliant. But the victory didn't end there. The judge noted the volume of evidence I'd provided of harassment. She didn't issue a ruling on it that day, but she did something better. She opened the door for me to countersue, and as Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her red blazer flashing like a warning light, I knew the war had shifted. For years she had ruled unchecked, unchallenged, confident that fear alone would keep her neighbors in line. But now the courts had spoken, and her authority was crumbling. Back home, my neighbors greeted me differently. Some shook my hand openly, thanking me for standing up. Others nodded from their driveways, emboldened but cautious. Word spread quickly. The HOA had lost, Karen had failed. And the rebellion of beige was no longer just symbolic, it was legal. But I also knew Karen wasn't done. Defeat only hardened her resolve. She would come back, perhaps subtler, perhaps more desperate. And as the leaves turned and the nights grew colder, the neighborhood braced itself for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain, Karen wasn't going down without a final fight. And the final fight was going to be uglier than anything the neighborhood had seen before. The courtroom loss should have been the end. For most people, it would have been enough. A dismissal, humiliation in front of the judge, and the realization that their power had limits. But Karen Whitfield was not most people. Defeat didn't soften her. It sharpened her. In the days after the ruling, she vanished from public view. No clipboard patrols, no flyers taped to lampposts, no red blazer marching down the sidewalks. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. Some thought she was finally beaten, retreating to lick her wounds. Others whispered that she was regrouping, planning something bigger. I didn't let myself grow complacent. The war wasn't over, not with someone like Karen. She was too deeply invested, too obsessed with control to let go. I kept my binder of evidence updated, watching, waiting. And then one night the lights went out. It was a cold November evening, the kind where the air bites and the ground glistens with frost. I was sitting in my living room when, without warning, the entire block plunged into darkness. The hum of appliances died, streetlights blinked out, and silence spread like a heavy blanket. At first, I assumed it was a power company issue, lines down, maybe a blown transformer. But within minutes, whispers rippled through the neighborhood. Phones lit up, flashlights flickered in windows, and people stepped onto porches. The outage wasn't citywide. It wasn't even across the whole neighborhood. It was targeted. Only my side of the street had gone dark. I walked outside, my breath fogging in the cold, and that's when I saw her. Karen stood at the end of the block with two of her loyal board members, their flashlights sweeping across the houses like searchlights. They weren't panicked like the rest of us. They were purposeful. It didn't take a genius to put the pieces together. The HOA had made a move that went beyond bylaws and fines. They had tampered with the power. Whether by pulling strings with the utility company or through backdoor connections, they had orchestrated a blackout as punishment, a lesson for defiance. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And it was exactly the kind of desperate stunt Karen would pull when backed into a corner. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I documented. I filmed the outage, the flashlights, the targeted darkness. I interviewed neighbors, many of whom were furious, trapped in cold houses with freezers thawing and kids shivering. For the first time, Karen's crusade wasn't just about my house, it was punishing everyone around me. By morning, the power was restored, but the damage had been done. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral were outraged. Families had lost hundreds in spoiled groceries. Elderly residents had gone without heat, and children had cried in the dark. The whispers that followed weren't just about my house anymore. They were about Karen's abuse of power. The petition to remove her from the board exploded overnight. Signatures poured in, fueled by anger and fear. Even some of her former allies turned against her, unwilling to defend a blackout that endangered their own homes. But Karen wasn't finished. Her next move was subtler, but more insidious. She began weaponizing rumors. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of being the cause of the outage, claiming I had sabotaged the grid for attention. The flyers warned that my rebellion was driving down property, values, and putting children at risk. The language was hysterical, but hysteria spreads quickly in close-knit neighborhoods. For a while, the community was split. Some believed the rumors, others dismissed them. The line between fact and fiction blurred as Karen stoked fear. But where she miscalculated was underestimating how much evidence I had already gathered. Within a week, I hosted a quiet gathering in my backyard. No speeches, no shouting, just a projector, a screen, and the truth. I played the footage of Karen and her board members, standing at the end of the block during the blackout, their flashlights sweeping like sentries. I displayed the timestamps, the outage maps from the utility company confirming no citywide issues. I laid out the pattern, every attempt she'd made to intimidate, harass, and now endanger. The silence that followed was heavy. People exchanged looks, anger simmering in their eyes. For the first time, Karen wasn't just the overbearing HOA president. She was a liability. From that night on, the neighborhood shifted. Support for the petition surged, signatures multiplying until it reached critical mass. A special vote was called, set for early December. Karen's reign was hanging by a thread. But in the days leading up to the vote, she made one final desperate move. The HOA filed a cease and desist letter, demanding I repaint my house before the vote could be held. They claimed my house was inciting unrest and that immediate action was required for the safety of the community. The letter carried no legal weight, but its timing was deliberate, a last attempt to sway public opinion before her fate was sealed. I didn't back down. Instead, I doubled down. I lit up my house with floodlights, illuminating every bold, blazing inch of beige for the neighborhood to see. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was a declaration. The night before the vote, I walked the street. Windows glowed warmly, conversations hummed behind doors. People who once avoided eye contact now greeted me openly. Some with nods, others with words of encouragement. The tide had turned. When the vote came, the result was decisive. Karen Whitfield was removed from the HOA board. Her red blazer never appeared in the clubhouse again. The clipboard patrols ended. The flyers stopped. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. But even in victory, I knew the story wasn't over. Power leaves scars, and Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. Her pride had been shattered, her authority stripped, but her bitterness remained. And though she no longer ruled the HOA, she was still my neighbor. The Beige War was over. But the fallout, the final reckoning, was yet to come. Karen Whitfield's removal from the HOA board should have been the end. The vote was decisive. The neighborhood had turned against her. And for the first time in years, people felt free to breathe without the constant shadow of her clipboard patrols. But power is like an addiction. When stripped from someone who built their entire identity around control, it doesn't simply vanish. It festers, curdles, and re-emerges in new, more toxic ways. In the weeks after the vote, Karen disappeared from public view. Her once frequent presence at the clubhouse was gone. The mailbox flyers dried up. The sidewalks were no longer patrolled. For most neighbors, it was a relief. They moved on, decorating for the holidays, hosting block parties, and reclaiming the neighborhood spirit that had long been suffocated. For me, though, the silence felt different. It wasn't peace. It was the eye of a storm. I kept my guard up. I checked my cameras daily, documented any unusual activity, and kept my binder of evidence ready. A person like Karen didn't simply stop. She plotted. She obsessed. And sooner or later, she would strike again. The first sign came in January. It started small. Trash scattered across my lawn. Egg splatters against my siding. Tire tracks cut across the edge of my driveway. Petty acts of vandalism. Too small to involve police, too vague to prove. But the timing was no coincidence. Soon, more aggressive tactics followed. Anonymous complaints poured into city offices. False reports about illegal construction, hazardous waste, and unlicensed tenants. Inspectors showed up at my door, confused but professional, and each time they left empty-handed. The accusations were baseless, but the intent was clear. Harassment through bureaucracy. Neighbors began whispering again. They had seen a familiar figure, late at night, slipping between houses, peering from behind hedges. Karen hadn't vanished. She had gone underground. One evening, as I reviewed my security footage, there she was, grainy but unmistakable. Karen in her red coat, hood pulled low, trespassing on my property with a flashlight. She paused at my floodlit beige wall. The color she despised most, her face twisted in fury. She lingered for several minutes, muttering to herself, before retreating into the shadows. That was the final straw. I compiled everything. Footage of her trespassing, records of false complaints, testimony from neighbors who had witnessed her prowling. I handed the entire file to law enforcement. This was no longer an HOA dispute. This was stalking. The police took it seriously. Karen was issued a formal warning, and for the first time, the law itself told her what I had been saying all along. Her control had limits. But Karen wasn't wired to accept limits. The night after the warning, she made her last and most reckless move. It was past midnight when I woke to the acrid smell of smoke. Heart pounding, I leapt from bed and rushed to the window. My floodlights illuminated the source. A pile of burning trash smoldering against my fence line. Flames licking dangerously close to the wood. If I hadn't woken when I did, the fire could have spread. My house, my family, the neighboring homes, everything could have gone up in flames. I grabbed the hose, doused the fire, and called the fire department. By the time they arrived, the danger was contained, but the evidence was undeniable. The remnants of flyers, the same kind Karen had used to smear me, were among the ashes. That was it. The final, irreversible line had been crossed. When the police came back, they didn't bring another warning. They brought handcuffs. Karen Whitfield, once the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, was arrested for arson, trespassing, and harassment. The woman who once strutted with a clipboard was led away in the back of a squad car. Her face pale, her composure shattered. The neighborhood watched in silence as the lights of the patrol car faded into the night. The aftermath was like a cleansing storm. With Karen gone, the HOA was forced to rebuild from the ground up. New leadership was elected, people with level heads, who saw the HOA as a tool for maintaining community, not a weapon for enforcing conformity. Rules were revised, fines were softened, and flexibility returned. The rigid uniformity that had once strangled the neighborhood gave way to individuality. Gardens flourished, paint colors varied, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. As for me, I left my house exactly as it was, the legal maximum shade of beige, blazing proudly in the sunlight. It stood as a monument to the fight, a reminder that power without accountability always collapses under its own weight. But more importantly, it stood as proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't about retaliation, it's about endurance, about holding the line, refusing to bend and letting those who abuse power destroy themselves in their desperation to control. Months passed. Seasons changed. The neighborhood healed. Children played freely in yards. Neighbors gathered without fear of fines, and the air of paranoia lifted. Karen's name became a cautionary tale, whispered but never spoken too loudly, as though invoking it might summon her back. And me? I finally felt peace. The war was over. The beige house still stood brighter than ever, and every time I looked at it, I remembered the truth Karen had tried so hard to suppress. That freedom doesn't come from control. It comes from the courage to resist it.